Hello and welcome to another TLDR Explains video. We spent weeks discussing the lack of PPE and the government's urgent need for more protective equipment for hospitals and essential workers. Eventually, the government seemed able to locate such a supply and, well, everyone was happier for a moment. That was until people started digging into the government's, let's call it, unorthodox PPE procurement scheme and how some companies and individuals seem to have taken advantage of it, reaping the rewards of taxpayer spending. If you feel that the news can get somewhat overwhelming, let me tell you about the TLDR News Daily Briefing. Every day, we release a briefing full of the most important and interesting stories that you might have missed. You can read the briefing on our website, or by signing up for the newsletter. There's a link to that down below. Or, if you prefer, you can listen to the briefing in podcast format. The show's now available on basically every podcast platform, so you can just search for TLDR News. Thanks for your support, and I really hope that you like the daily briefing. Before we get into the dodgy deals that the government seems to have been doing over the past few months, let's go back a bit. You'll remember in March and April, there was a lot of reporting about how the NHS didn't have enough PPE, and doctors were wearing aprons instead of surgical gowns, using snorkels instead of masks, and that sort of thing. The government said that this was because the global demand for PPE had obviously skyrocketed after the coronavirus crisis, which had made PPE hard to source. This is sort of true, but the UK government did make life harder for itself by being particularly slow about it. By the time the government accepted that it needed to start buying PPE, it was way behind other countries. The UK only really started buying PPE in mid-April, and its online PPE procurement e-portal opened on May 27th. For context, the EU launched its first joint procurement, which the UK decided not to be involved with, on February 28th, a good 6 weeks ahead of the UK. Anyway, the point is that by the time the government realised it wanted to buy loads of PPE, most of it had already been snapped up, and the government needed to act fast. Now, usually when the government wants to buy something like PPE, there's what's called a competitive tendering process. Basically, the government says we want 10 million face masks, and then lots of companies say we can sell 10 million face masks for X pounds. Whoever can do it for the cheapest, or in some cases best, gets the contract, and that's who the government buys from. This process is supposed to guarantee public value for money and prevent cronyism. Basically, prevent people in government from giving their mates lucrative government contracts. However, this process takes time. You have to advertise the contract, compare different offers, and that sort of thing. So, in extreme circumstances, the government can use what's called direct award. Direct award is when the government just gives the contract straight to a company, without any competition. According to the Public Contract Regulations 2015, there are 2 cases where direct award is allowed. Direct award due to extreme urgency, where extreme urgency is brought about by events unforeseeable by the contracting entity, or direct award due to the absence of competition or protection of exclusive rights, basically when only one company could possibly do the contract anyway. Because of the time pressure, the government started using direct awards for PPE procurement, and they spent a total of £15 billion on PPE, which means a lot of contracts. The Good Law Project, who we'll talk about more at the end of this video, suspected that there could be some dodgy contracts hidden among the £15 billion, in part because they just found out that on March 3rd, the government had given a direct award contract worth £840,000 to a small polling company called Public First, owned by husband and wife Rachel Wolfe and James Frayne, who just happened to be ex-advisors to Michael Gove when he was in the Department of Education. By the way, Dominic Cummings was also in the Department of Education at the same time. Anyway, it seems that their suspicions were well founded, because they've so far found 3 pretty suspicious contracts, and 1 very suspicious contract. And we'll go through them in order, from least suspicious first. So, to start with, there's Aventis Solutions Limited. Aventis is an employment agency with net assets of £322. Interestingly, they were awarded an £18.5 million contract for face masks on May 12th, and to be fair to them, they did actually fulfil their contractual obligation, and claim they've been supplying the NHS off and on for the past 9 years, but nonetheless it does seem a bit weird. The second, far more suspicious contract is actually 2 separate contracts, both awarded the same company, Clandboy Agencies Limited. Clanboy, a sweet supplier, was awarded a contract worth £14.28 million on April 28th, and a second worth £93.24 billion on May 18th, in return for 25.6 million surgical gowns. Yep, that's right, a sweet supplier was handed £108 million worth of PPE procurement contracts. Anyway, to make it more dodgy, when the Good Law Project originally asked about it, Hancock's lawyers claimed that they delivered on all but 400,000 gowns. However, the government then corrected themselves and admitted that actually 6 million were yet to be delivered. They also made a typo somewhere, because in their first letter it says 400,000, but their correction letter says 40,000. But hey ho. Again, to be fair, they're apparently on track for this delivery, and according to their solicitor, it's because they actually have a sister company who can do the deliveries, whatever that means. The third interesting contract is with Crisp Websites Limited, a company that trades as PestFix, and had net assets of £18,000 and 16 employees as of the 30th of November 2019. The government originally said that PestFix was awarded a 12-month, £108 million contract for gloves, gowns and masks, but when pressed by the Good Law Project, they claimed that the contract was actually only worth £32 million, and was for isolation suits specifically. But that wasn't the only contract PestFix had been given. It's interesting that the government thought a 12-month contract could qualify as urgent, but perhaps even more interestingly, the government claimed that the other contracts would be published in the coming weeks. It's now been quite a few weeks and they still haven't been published. By the way, the government's own guidance states that contracts should be published within 20 days, and it's now been nearly 4 months since April 13th, when the £32 million contract was agreed, and 2 months since June 16th, when that letter was sent. So those are the three slightly suspicious contracts. You've got an £18.5 million contract with an employment agency with total assets of £322, 2 contracts worth a total of £108 million with a sweet supplier, and a 12-month £32 million contract with a pest control company with assets of less than £20,000. We say only slightly suspicious because, to be fair, they've all delivered on at least part of their contracts. They're mainly suspicious because the companies behind them are tiny and not nominally in the medical supply industry, but they all seem to be doing better than you might expect. However, it's the fourth contract which begins to look super suspicious. To understand how questionable it is, we're going to need some introductions. First, Andrew Mills. Mills is an advisor to the government's Board of Trade, which is part of the Department for International Trade. Interestingly, the department no longer publishes a list of its advisors, but luckily for us, it's right there on the web archive. On his LinkedIn, it says that he's a senior board advisor to a company called Ayanda Capital Limited. As you can see, he's also the founder of a company called Prosper Mill, though he's since removed that from his LinkedIn. Keep both these names in mind though, because they'll be relevant in a sec. He's quite a hard man to track down online, at least partially because he's being reported on so heavily at this point. But according to Jonathan Friedland at The Guardian, in the past he's been seen as a staunch Brexiteer. Anyway, back to those companies. Prosper Mill was set up in February 2019 and is sort of a shell company. It's worth nothing and it does nothing. The only interesting thing about it is that it was set up by Andrew Mills. Ayanda is a private equity company that apparently specialises in currency trading, offshore property, private equity, and trade financing. Basically, it's one of those generic finance companies. Notably, it has no history of PPE procurement or anything medical for that matter at all. So when the government gave Ayanda a directly awarded £252 million contract for 50 million FFP2 masks and 150 million Type IIR masks, the Good Law Project asked why. The government response claimed that originally they'd instead given the contract to Prosper Mill. Yep, that's right, the government gave a £252 million contract to a box-fresh, year-old company with no business experience and total assets of £100. Apparently, Prosper Mill had secured exclusive rights to the full production capacity at a large factory in China, which could make the masks cheaply. This is, let's be honest, more than a little implausible. Why would a Chinese factory producing PPE give full production rights to a tiny box-fresh company when demand for PPE was at an all-time high, unless there was some sort of extra guarantee? Anyway, Prosper Mill asked the government to use Ayanda instead because they didn't have the established international banking infrastructure that could be used to effect the necessary payments overseas, whatever that means. The government obligingly did so, and Ayanda went ahead with the contract. This would be dodgy as it stands, because it looks like the government is giving a £252 million contract to a government advisor, or at least one of its companies. But to make it worse, Ayanda messed up the order. The 50 million FFP2 masks, of which 43.5 million have so far been delivered, didn't meet the government specification because they had ear loops instead of head loops. Now, Ayanda dispute this and say at the time the government only asked for ear loops. But Web Archive pages from April seem to state quite clearly that head loops are required. Anyway, whoever's fault it is, the average price of an FFP2 mask in April was about £2.38, which means the government wasted about £119 million on useless FFP2 masks. Furthermore, the Type IIR masks supplied by Ayanda haven't been tested for use yet, so there's a chance that they too could be faulty. By the way, the average price for a Type IIR mask was 51p in April, which means that the 150 million Type IIR masks would have cost Ayanda about £76.5 million. Just doing some back-of-the-napkin calculations, that means 119 million on FFP2 masks and 76.5 million on Type IIR masks, which leaves a hefty £56 million in profit for Andrew Mills, or Prosper Mill, or Ayanda. Oh yeah, and it's worth noting we don't know who gets what from Ayanda, because it's registered in the tax haven of Mauritius. Basically, the taxpayer lost £119 million on faulty FFP2 masks, and then it would seem gave a company associated with the government advisor nearly £56 million in profit, all of which went to a tax haven. Good business all round, lads. Anyway, it's certainly all looking pretty dodgy, and we'll see what comes out of the legal proceeding in the weeks and months ahead. Which leads us nicely to the last thing we'd like to say, and that is, all of these legal proceedings have been brought and funded by the Good Law Project, which is a not-for-profit member organisation, which uses the law to protect the interests of the public. It's a phenomenally important cause, and they do great work. We're not sponsored by them or anything, but we've left information to them in the description, so if you want to support them or find out more about their work, then we'd encourage you to do so. As I say, we're not sponsored at all. We just think that they're a necessary check to make sure that no government, no politician or party can get away with any form of cronyism. Be sure to let us know what you think about this in the comments below. And of course, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified as we post more videos on this topic. And finally, a special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. If you want to see your name listed at the end of videos just like these people, then be sure to back us on Patreon. There's a link to that in the description.